Hello, everybody. My name is Mark Chupka. I'm the Vice President for Research and Programs here at the Energy Storage Association. Thank you for attending today's webinar on hybrid market participation rules, recent developments and implications, with a focus on the California ISO and Texas ERCOT. This webinar is being recorded. Everyone who registered will also receive a link to the recording and slides within the next couple of days. Questions can be submitted at any time throughout the webinar via the questions chat box in your browser, and we'll get to those after our speakers finish their presentations. In the text of your question, please indicate to whom you would like your question addressed. All meetings and teleconferences of the Energy Storage Association are held in accordance with our antitrust guidelines. We ask that you abide by these guidelines during today's webinar. The full guidelines are available in the members area of the ESA website. If you are not yet an ESA member and would like more information, you can reach out to my colleague, Brenda Lovell. Membership includes free access to all of our webinars, including many that are exclusively for members, among numerous other benefits. So please contact Brenda for more information. Before we begin, I would like to announce a related upcoming ESA event. The premier energy storage event of energy policy event pertaining to storage is just a couple of weeks away, namely the ESA Energy Storage Policy Forum on February 3rd and 4th. Please check this out on the ESA website. The 2021 Policy Forum features keynote addresses from a host of energy policy stars, including newly appointed FERC Chair Richard Glick, President of PJM Manu Asthana, Representative Blumenthal, and Senator Collins. Today, we're exploring the implications of recent developments in accommodating storage into RTO and ISO markets, with a focus on California and Texas. I am delighted to introduce an excellent panel for today's discussion. First up will be John Fernandez, Senior Consultant for Emerging Technologies at Customized Energy Solutions. He will describe recent hybrid policy developments in ERCOT. Chris Devon will be next. He is the Director of Market Intelligence West and is a colleague of John's at CES. He will take on California developments in hybrid resource participation rules. Our final presenter is Gigio Sakota, the Director of Energy Markets at 8 Minutes Solar Energy. Gigio will present the perspective of a hybrid resource developer on how market participation rules affect project economics, with a focus on California ISO. After their remarks, we'll open up to audience Q&A. You can ask questions via the questions chat box at any time, and we'll read those out for presenters when we get to the Q&A session at the end. Now I'll turn it over to John.
All right, thank you kindly, Mark. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Appreciate you joining us for the conversation today. John Fernandez, Senior Consultant with Customized Energy Solutions. Looks like I'm still waiting to have control of the slides here. There we go. Quickly make the marketing guys happy. CES, very markets-centric consulting firm. We focus heavily on the US, ISOs, RTOs, also get involved in a lot of state activities. We follow all of these regulatory proceedings very closely, help our clients strategize, their business and investments based on the changing policy landscape. In downtown Philadelphia, we also have a 24-hour operations center. We are a scheduling entity for all markets across North America. Those guys have something like 11 gigawatts of resources under their control right now, including over 300 megawatts of energy storage. My group, Emerging Technologies, we also follow policy developments and have an in-house modeling platform we use to help our clients site, develop, and deploy actual storage and hybrid storage projects. Whoops. Okay. So hybrid storage, these conversations have been taking place for some time now. Really what a lot of folks are looking for is improvement in the capability and performance in the renewable component that is behind the point of interconnection with the storage resource. This is especially big in capacity markets. You get the qualification, can better provide resource adequacy, financial impacts, mitigating things like curtailment on the resource, And as these projects have been getting deployed and we're getting some operational data, you can really get down into the technical aspects and configurations of projects. You can address things like solar clipping, impacts on inverters, other components of the systems. So plenty of quantifiable benefits when it comes to hybrid storage. One thing that's not on this slide is efficiencies gained in the development process. We have plenty of clients that come to us and say, I want to put storage at this generator site simply because I think I can do it without moving the fence around a substation. Land acquisition, permitting, getting that point of interconnection, having access to a substation. These can be very time consuming, very costly for project developers. And so just to be able to deploy storage, even if it's acting as its own independent resource at that site, can be a big advantage to have a fleet of assets already existing where you can do the siting. Okay, so I'm going to be focusing on ERCOT, the Texas market. A lot has happened with storage in ERCOT over the past couple of years. Looking back maybe 5 years ago, very difficult to do much of anything in Texas when it came to energy storage. You started to see a little bit of activity picking up towards the end of 2018. In 2019, some major stakeholders, major market participants in ERCOT finally started to push for some market enhancements that would favor an energy limited resource platforms like storage. And things really exploded from there. You can see how quickly investors started coming to the market, getting queue positions. There was a storage task force that was formed in 2019 that just concluded at the end of 2020 with the approval of some really substantial nodal protocol revision requests, NPRRs, that are going to create a unique asset class for storage in Texas. They're really going to do what Order 841 did for storage in the FERC jurisdictional markets. Like it says here right now, there's over 23 gigawatts of storage in the ERCOT interconnection queue. It's been interesting to watch the dynamics of hybrids in ERCOT. Looking back towards the end of 2019, there were actually more hybrid storage plants in the queue than there were standalone storage. Moving forward, as you can see, that dynamic has dramatically flipped with standalone really being the dominant business strategy for storage in Texas. Having analyzed the market structure, the opportunities, I think CES has a pretty good sense of why that is happening. One dynamic that I think makes ERCOT very different from the other US markets, especially when it comes to hybrid storage, is a lack of any kind of capacity structure. And that's not just a capacity market. The Southwest Power Pool doesn't have a capacity market, but they still have a resource adequacy structure that values certain duration resources, a certain amount of reliability, and that can be quantified. It can impact the PPAs that project developers can and do sign with the load responsible entities, LREs and SPP, that have to be cute with their own acronym. No such structure of any kind exists in Texas. So the benefit, you can certainly still improve the performance of a renewable resource in Texas. You can talk about congestion. There's plenty of transmission issues across the ERCOT footprint, but without having to worry about capacity qualification. This is just me personally. I speculate if that's driving a lot of just the standalone storage opportunity down there in the market. Okay. Talked about these NPRRs that went into place at the end of 2020 as we've been transitioning into this year. So one of them did include AC coupled hybrid storage. It was my favorite NPRR because it was a page and a half long, and it was effectively one sentence that said AC coupled resources will be treated as separate registered resources in the market. You got to register it twice, meter everything separately. You're going to offer, get scheduled, deployed as two different resources. So very straightforward if you're doing an AC configured system. DC coupled resources actually got their own NPRR. And really, I think is probably farthest along with any of the ISOs when it comes to accommodating DC coupled resources. The challenge is the metering. I think I'm going to get this correct. There currently is no ANSI certified revenue grade settlement that can talk to all of the components of a DC coupled resource behind the point of interconnection. You lose the inverter, you know, the hardware is different back there. And so what markets have not been able to cope with is not being able to settle all of the components. ERCOT decided to move forward with that, and effectively, ERCOT staff actually said, behind the point of interconnection, it's all going to be a black box. They are going to worry about settlement at the point of interconnection, and then there's going to be telemetry requirements for the renewables component, the storage component, whatever it may be, that will give ERCOT the necessary, as they call it, situational awareness to be able to run the market, you know, relying on DC coupled hybrid storage systems. So you can see some of the rules here, how ERCOT has sketched this out. So right now for DC coupled resources, ERCOT is only contemplating storage plus wind or solar. In the previous slide, you saw there actually is storage co-located with thermal in the interconnection queue. We CES have actually studied and modeled storage plus thermal plants for clients around the country. That is a thing. It is not a thing for this NPRR. How the resource gets treated is really up to the resource's QSC, your qualified scheduling entity, and this is the entity bringing your resource to the market. CES, our wholesale group, is a QSC in ERCOT. If the QSC has submitted injection or withdrawal from the storage component, or has submitted your HSL, LSL, high and low sustained limits, if that reflects the capability of the storage resource, or if the DC coupled resource is carrying an ancillary service obligation, then the resource is going to be treated as a storage resource. At all other times, that DC coupled system is going to be treated as an intermittent renewable resource. So really, if the QSC is relying on the capability of the storage or the responsiveness of storage specifically to participate in the ancillary services market, then it's storage. At all other times, it's a renewable. The QSC, ERCOT did build in some flexibility for the QSC to change some of the operating parameters and the operating condition, if you will, of a DC coupled storage plant. You can change the HSL, the LSL, and you can change those values, again, based on the capability of the storage plant. You can go higher in your high sustainable limit, so basically how much you can bring to the market, if your storage capability can carry that obligation should you be awarded. And then the rest of this, as you can see here, a lot of this has to do with forecasts on the intermittent component. So on that note, and reflecting some of what I talked about when it comes to telemetry and metering, there still has to be site-specific meteorological forecasting data that the resource, the DC coupled plant, sends to ERCOT, and that is part of the telemetry that in that black box, so to speak, behind the point of interconnection. And you can, again, I'm not going to read through all this. You can see the requirements here, you know, depending DC, AC, the capability of the renewable component will inform how much this resource can participate in the market. So that's really, to me, kind of the most important. This NPRR reflects the most important protocols, the tariffs in ERCOT, protocol changes that are going to be taking place in the ERCOT market to accommodate hybrid storage. And really, we're focusing on DC because AC is just you're participating in the market. The other one, I appear to have lost control of my slides. Oh, there it is. Self-limiting facilities, NPR 1026. You're still following the rules for market participation. What this NPRR is allowing developers to do is install greater nameplate capacity behind the point of interconnection then is reflected in your interconnection agreement. And a lot of this has to do with some recent FERC orders having to do with supplemental interconnection service, all that sort of thing. As long as, and it's really the QSC, but we'll just say the developer, the asset owner, has to fill out an attestation saying we will not go over what's in the interconnection agreement regardless of what we've installed. And you have to show how, and or either physically or via software, you will be able to limit the injection of that system. You can install greater capability behind that point of interconnection. And really, especially with a storage component, this allows you to spread that energy value over a greater period, capture some of that clipped energy on the solar side, whatever it may be. So there are still some technical requirements, and some of them are quite technical. There's reactive power requirements. You can lose your qualification as a self-limiting resource if you exceed these thresholds, greater 5 megawatts or 3%. And again, this all falls back to the QSC, really reflected in the COP, which is the current operating plan in ERCOT. It's really your forecast of your resources capability over, I think it's a 7-day look ahead. And then your high and low limits, all the telemetered information behind the point of interconnection. And for all of this, emphasizing one last point, a lot of the conversation tends to default to the HSL, the high limit, really what you're injecting with your hybrid resource. You also have to respect your PMIN, which is really going to end up being the withdrawal of the storage resource if you end up withdrawing from the grid. So we always just make sure developers keep that in mind. You have to respect the high and low limits of your point of interconnection. So I think that's really it as far as ERCOT goes. Give them, staff down there, a lot of credit for getting these rules in place very quickly. Again, for being one of the only markets, I think, to have a full market participation roadmap for DC coupled resources. And so, you know, we should be seeing a lot of these projects coming online here soon and see how they start performing. So with that, we will transition to California, and I will hand it over to my colleague, Chris.
Thanks, John. While I am getting control of the slides, just note that was a great overview of some of the technical details in the ERCOT market, and I think there's some good kind of parallels with some of the things that are being currently done for hybrid policies in California, and then I think there's a little bit of nuanced differences as well. So I'll try to touch on some of those as I move through my slides. So again, I'm Chris Devon, Director of Market Intelligence West for CES. So I cover a lot of the CAISO policy development process and report on that out to some of our clients. So with that, I would also just note that I also previously worked at the CAISO on some of their hybrid resource development policies. So I do have a pretty good background on some of this material as well, and just wanted to note that as part of this. So let's see here. I think I have control of the slides, but I can't seem to get to the next ones. There we go. All right. So just wanted to kick it off by mentioning some of the differences in the different participation models. I think I went one slide too far though. Let's see here. Bit of a delay, I apologize. There we go. Okay. I keep going back and forth. So if I can get back to slide 18, that's the one I wanted to kick it off on. And I was just going to mention some of the market participation models. Here we go. Okay. So in CAISO, there's really two options. And I wanted to try to specify that because it certainly has an impact on a number of things that are important to the development and participation. The hybrid resource model is when you have a single resource ID with multiple technology components behind a single point of interconnection. So you can model this kind of a resource as either traditional generator or not NGR resource, non-generator resource. So you could have a combination of really any type of resources. Now, most of my comments today will be focused on the idea of the solar plus storage hybrid, or wind plus storage, renewable component added to a storage component. But there is the ability to add thermal resources with storage and combine those into a single resource ID. So that is, an option, kind of as John had noted earlier, that you could look at, and there are some of those type of resources actively participating in the CAISO markets right now. But the idea here is that this kind of a resource would have a single bid curve. It allows for the scheduling coordinator to optimize the underlying use of the components to meet any of the CAISO awards or dispatch. So there's some, flexibility benefits, and that can potentially be utilized to manage a number of things I'll touch on a little bit later. The other market participation model is the co-located option, and this is when you have 2 or more resource IDs behind a single POI. So you would have a standalone VER, like a solar resource, and then a storage resource. They would each have their own modeling for the resource characteristics. They each submit their own bid curve. They each have their own separate awards and settlements, and so all those things are treated essentially separate, but there's still the limitation based on the point of interconnection. And there is a new policy in place that will allow the resources to be managed to stay within that interconnection based off kind of the market dispatch and the economics of the resource. So under this co-located option, the CAISO still considers the VER forecast and the stated charge feasibility for the different awards for the solar and storage components. Let's see, next slide. So on this slide, I just want to touch on some of the considerations for the single resource ID hybrid models. So the biggest one is the idea that the bids are required in the real time to be submitted 75 minutes in advance of the hour and can't be updated after that. This is what this figure here on slide 19 is showing, kind of just to illustrate the time frame for when you actually have to provide your bids for these. It's for all resources in the real-time market, but there's no special treatment for these hybrid resources. And it's significant because obviously things can change as far as the variability of the underlying resource components. The solar production forecast can change, after that deadline. And then also the choice for doing on-site charging with the solar production and the storage charging, those things can change kind of what your intent really to deliver a certain amount of energy to the market is. So that's a consideration that I'll talk a little bit more about in the next slide. But the other couple of things I wanted to note about the hybrid model is that it's still, even though there's a renewable component behind it, it's not treated as a variable energy resource or eligible intermittent resource, in the sense that the CAISO doesn't use the VER forecast to update the offers or awards for the resource, and is treated more traditionally like an NGR, like it's just a standalone storage resource, in the sense that the market isn't going to limit the outputs based off of the VER forecast. It's going to be using just your bids that are submitted to the market, and then the dynamic limit concept that I'll touch a little bit later. The other thing to note is that it doesn't use the state of charge of the battery either. So, that's notable in that the co-located option does allow for the state of charge to be managed by the ISO market. In this sense, this gives more flexibility to the resource owner, scheduling coordinator to try to manage and optimize the use of the underlying components, but it also presents some risk and needs a little bit more management of your bids and market participation, and might take a little bit more nuance in that sense. And then there is some other new provisions that the CAISO has just been putting in place that are intended to allow hybrid resources to provide ancillary services, which is good because previously they weren't allowed to do that. And it also allows for hybrid resources to communicate their generation availability in real time through this new functionality that I'll touch on next. So on this slide, I just want to introduce the dynamic limit concept. So the CAISO has this hybrid resource dynamic limit idea that they have been discussing through their policy stakeholder initiatives. They just wrapped that up and they're going to be filing with FERC shortly. But the idea is that it allows the management of that real-time market participation. It allows them to update their availability in the real-time market on a 5-minute basis so that you can ensure a feasible market award and dispatch is issued to the resource. You can limit the upward and downward capability. It's intended to really reflect the VER component's variability, but there's some potential that it might be able to be used for kind of the decision for on-site storage charging and kind of managing the ITC issues and things like restrictions for how much you want to cycle the battery and that sort of thing. So there's some good functionality that's being built here and allowing for flexibility to try to leverage the benefits of these new technologies as you combine them into one single resource ID. And the real-time market participation becomes very complicated. This is a tool to try to help manage that, due to the bidding timeframes and then the market dynamics of not really seeing those VER forecasts or state of charge in the ultimate dispatch of the resources. So that's a big thing for the single resource ID model here. But I just want to note too that I think that this concept, while it's a new and advanced concept, it may need some further refinement and coordination with other rules and provisions, specifically things related to the RA availability concerns, market power mitigation, again, some of those ITC considerations or other contractual obligations, and how it all works together is still kind of being worked out at the CAISO. And once they get a little bit more experience with some of these resources, they may have a need to kind of change some of those rules or refine them in a sense. So the next one I wanted to touch on is some considerations on co-located resources. So the two separate resource IDs behind a single POI. Again, they model those resources individually so you can reflect each individual resource characteristics. It uses the state of charge in the VER forecast, so that is different from the hybrid model. The overall project is going to need to meet the awards for each of the different resource IDs, and then you have to coordinate the operations. So there is some complexity there in the sense that, similar to kind of what John was mentioning, you have to really have controllability through software to ensure that your, point of interconnection limit isn't gone over during the actual operations in the 5-minute or even intra 5-minute basis due to the variability of that intermittent resource component. And then the other thing is that to be able to enable the on-site charging of the co-located storage resource, and again, that's something that's a big ITC concern. What the CAISO has been noting is that they want to have coordinated bidding and market awards. So you would have to have some kind of an award for the solar resource to be producing at the same time that you have a storage charging award, and then they can still treat that as on-site charging. And obviously, every individual company needs to make their own determination on that, but that's the way that they've been describing it through the stakeholder process, which should be good to try to help manage some of those ITC concerns. But there's still some outstanding developments that people are questioning exactly how that treatment really should be viewed as far as some of those tax related issues. And the last thing I just want to note is on this one for co-located resources that their PMAX issue of the overall resources were limited in a way where they couldn't go above their point of interconnection limit for the overall project. And so that was notable in that they have tried to solve that issue as far as allowing for additional installed capacity to be accessed in a way, for instance, when the solar has additional capability built in and let's say there's no charging or discharge from the battery, the solar might be able to go all the way up to the POI limit itself. And then vice versa, when there's no solar production, the battery can produce all the way up to the interconnection limit, depending on the size of the underlying resources. But the idea there is to not strand any of that capacity or energy behind the POI to make more efficient use of that interconnection rights that the overall project has. Okay, so next one. Again, I just wanted to note this new aggregate capability constraint concept that the CAISO has developed. It's currently in use now. It's intended to address that issue. So It really takes a look at the full capacity or the full installed capacity of each of the resource IDs, and then allows it to be utilized again up to that full POI limit, and it uses the market bids for each of the resources to optimize the use of that. So obviously, your solar production is generally going to be pretty cheap, marginal cost. So that one will likely get dispatched, and it will limit the amount of the charging or discharging the battery to keep that within the POI limit overall. And then there's another aspect I wanted to note for the CAISO proposals on co-located, which is that they have filed some changes to allow for tariff provisions for the co-located storage resources to be able to deviate to absorb some of the co-located solar production in particular circumstances. So let's say your solar goes above what its real forecast was. The storage could be used on site to charge and essentially keep you within the limit, and then you wouldn't have to necessarily curtail that solar resource. But one note on that one is that right now they don't have any settlement linkage of those resources, so there could be some impact to some of the cost allocation for uplift charges and uninstructed imbalance energy and other things for those deviations. So while it's allowed under the CAISO tariff, it's not really reflected in the settlements system to kind of hold them harmless in that sense. And so the CAISO's been indicating that they're going to consider this kind of enhancement in the future because some of the stakeholders have been concerned about that aspect as well. Let's see here. So a little bit real quickly to touch on the CAISO RA issues. So resource adequacy is obviously the big thing in California, in contrast to kind of how John noted that ERCOT doesn't have the RA program or capacity market or anything like that. CAISO similarly doesn't have a capacity market, but they do have an RA program. And so there's a lot of things that you need to consider when you're thinking about developing hybrid resources or co-located resources in CAISO related to that. Particularly of note, the RA availability and bidding requirements. So you're going to have a must offer obligation if you're designated as an RA resource. The co-located resources have a offer requirement that's important to note. That's pretty important that you basically you get the exact same must offer obligation as you would if you were a standalone resource. So a VER resource or storage resource, they have their own reflective must offer requirements. Now, a hybrid resource, there's been discussions ongoing on how to develop the hybrid resource must offer requirements. And essentially what the CAISO has been proposing is that they would need to offer their full availability for their production, which could include their charging, discharging capabilities. So that's going to be important when you're thinking about how to manage some of those contractual limitations like the ITC grid charging and that sort of thing. And then, you're also going to need to think about some of those modeling approaches if you want to have, the ability to charge from the grid or not. You could be modeled as an NGR resource or a traditional generator with no negative capability or charging capability. So those are some ways to potentially manage those must offer obligation requirements, but they also could have an impact on your RA value as well. So a lot to think about there. The other thing is that the market awards and some of those hybrid resource dispatch instructions could be managed using the dynamic limit tool and certain other things like I just mentioned, the resource modeling. So that's important to think about as well. The other thing I would note on the capacity accreditation, there's a thing called capacity qualifying capacity or QC methodologies that the California Public Utilities Commission adopts. They're the ones that really choose how to value the resources. So there's ongoing proceedings in the California Public Utilities Commission that would potentially update those approaches. Right now, they have a methodology that's in place that does give similar capacity value to both hybrid resources and co-located resources. And then lastly, the last thing I wanted to note on the RA issues is the CAISO's recent unforced capacity proposal. Under their RA enhancements initiative, they've been proposing to use the concept of the dynamic limits as kind of a reduction in availability for the purpose of the proposed hybrid resource UCAP assessment, and that's going to potentially impact some of the capacity value of those resources and cause some incentive conflicts related to the ITC, renewable portfolio standard output or REC credits, and then things like the reliability, availability of the resources to be used in the most, beneficial manner. So I think that there's some challenges there related to this proposal. I just wanted to note at a high level, and I think that, possibly might change in the future as the CAISO continues its development of the proposal. So a couple other things I wanted to note to kind of wrap up my slides, on some other considerations and challenges. Obviously, the sizing of the storage is really important when you compare that to the variable resource component, and how that interacts. I think I've seen a lot of different various sizing of different storage and solar components, or storage and wind, and I think some folks may really need to consider that thoroughly, and there could be some issues related to undersizing or oversizing the storage or other components that you need to think about as well. Some of the things related to the Ppa contractual limitations, again, that ITC grid charging restriction is a big one. Storage resource cycling limitations or other kind of battery storage warranty concerns, renewable energy credit production requirements, all those things can be included in Ppa provisions that need to be thought about when you're developing these resources. Another thing is that in CAISO, I noted those two separate participation models. You can change your choice of those different configurations without having to go through the whole interconnection process or get a new generator interconnection agreement done. You just have to go through the CAISO's new resource implementation process, or NRI process, and then their full network model update. So it's generally pretty easy to change back and forth. It's not going to be like on a daily basis, but you could do it in a few weeks or a month or two, and not have a huge problem with that, because they already have a lot of technical specifications and documentation that's already been provided to do that. And then lastly, I think this is pretty self-evident, but the bidding and scheduling optimization for each of those participation modeling options is pretty important, and I just want to touch on that a little bit to wrap up my slides. So this slide here just shows you one of our products that CES offers, a bid optimization platform for energy storage, and this is just a sample dispatch over a day that shows you how energy frequency regulation, regulation up and down, and then spinning reserves and other types of offers are made and could be awarded through this optimization process, and in a way it can effectively manage the state of charge of the storage, and try to optimize the overall economics of the resource. And then the last slide that I wanted to note was just a example of this similar type of thing, but for a sample dispatch for a solar plus storage hybrid resource. So again, you see the different bids and offers and renewable offers, and you could combine this and do a single hybrid resource ID offer, or you could have separate ones under the co-located option. So just something I wanted to note that CES offers, and I think everyone needs to think about as you start to develop and participate in the markets with these kind of resources in CAISO. And I think with that wraps up my slides, and I'll turn it over to Gigio next. So thank you all.
Thank you. Hi everyone, I'm Gigio Sakota. I'm Director of Energy Markets at 8 Minute Solar Energy, and I'll continue delving into some of the CAISO market developments on the hybrid participation rules. Quick background, 8 Minute, we're one of the nation's largest solar and energy storage developers, a pretty large pipeline of projects. So we have about 2,000 megawatts of operating utility scale projects. We have another contract about 5,000 megawatts of solar and 2,500 megawatt hours of storage contracted. And we have a pipeline of 18 gigawatts of solar and 24 gigawatt hours of storage. So I'm definitely keeping an eye on how these assets will be able to operate in California and other markets, to make sure we can make the best use out of them. Quick background about California, and I think this is representative of numbers may be different, but the trend is probably similar across the nation. But we're looking at significant additions of clean energy, so solar, wind, and then storage to make sure that energy is available when we need it. Economics have shifted. When I joined the industry, I think solar and storage were probably the two most cost prohibitive resources, and now they're on the other end of the spectrum. So it's been a very welcome change and advancements in technology and other costs. And so it's economics, RPS targets, and other things are actually driving these procurement targets. In addition, we're also seeing significant uptick in corporate procurement. So it's companies that are trying to be green, and they're looking both at solar, wind, and storage assets. So we're pretty bullish on where the industry is going. So when it comes to hybrid and co-located resources, at least in the short run, they offer the best economics. So compared to standalone resources. I'll skip over the definitions, but essentially, hybrid resource really doesn't have to be renewable in storage, but it's two resources with different fuel sources or technologies. Co-located, essentially the same concept, except they're operating as separate resource IDs. And the advantages here, as we mentioned a little bit before, is you have the shared facilities, you have shared point of interconnection, which really can reduce your development time and cost. Especially in California, so some of the best locations may have long interconnection queues, or may require significant transmission upgrades to get full deliverability. So if you can take advantage of an existing queue position or operating asset and add to it, there's definitely significant savings. Obviously, energy storage paired with knowledge resources can qualify for investment tax credits. Certain rules apply, so ITC may be lost due to grid charging. An important point that was mentioned earlier, which allows these hybrid advantages, is that CAISO has updated its tariff to allow point of interconnection sharing for hybrid and co-located resources, and so we can more efficiently use the existing transmission facilities. So, quick overview of how these resources look from a CAISO perspective. On the right, I have a chart, which is from actually CAISO's hybrid resources proposal, shows metering for a co-located and a hybrid resource. CAISO has specified metering requirements so they can meet market settlement, reporting, and grid needs. And so you'll see in both of these configurations, for market settlements, you may only need, for a hybrid resource, you may only need the point of connection meter. But for reliability or for VR visibility through a CAISO, they actually require a meter on the VR component, a meter scenario. And then this metering is really for I'll call it AC configuration. If you have DC coupling, then there's my understanding is there's no approved CAISO approved DC meters, and so they have other methodologies that you can use. It can get fairly complex. In addition, when you're looking at metering here, there's also, you have to think about both wholesale and retail metering. And specifically in California for, I'll loosely call it aux loads, but on the battery, if the battery is idle, then those loads are considered retail. But if the battery is providing grid services, charging, discharging, and active in the market, then those are wholesale. And so you have to have proper metering setups, so that your utility can actually distinguish between the loads and so that you're basically properly billed and not double billed. And so anyway, in general, standard CAISO rules apply, but there's some specific changes for co-located and for hybrid configurations. As mentioned earlier, from a CAISO settlement perspective, hybrid resource would be co-located just on the joint point of interconnection output. Co-located resource would have actually two settlements. For example, charge battery, you would see two offsetting settlements. One where you're getting paid for putting energy on the grid, and the other one where you're paying to take the energy off the grid, assuming prices are positive at that moment. So looking at co-located resources, yes, that the resource was not co-located. So you get VR rules for the PV portion, non-generating rules for the non-generating resource rules for a BESS portion. They can individually bid up to their PMAX, and outage reporting and change and so forth. The point of connection limit is applied in the combined output. So if you have 100 megawatt PV and 50 megawatt storage, and you have an interconnection that's 100 megawatts, their combined output would never exceed 100 megawatts to the grid. And, each resource would get a separate award, dispatch would be bid separately. For hybrid resources, as mentioned earlier, to the grid, it will look like one resource. You provide a single bid, you get a single dispatch. You do not get VR status, which can provide some challenges. And there's this dynamic tool that Chris mentioned that you can use to report some of the dynamic limits. And specifics on that are still TBD, but the idea would be so you don't have to use outage cards for an availability due to ambient variability or state of charge conditions. So you can use this dynamic tool proactively, which simplifies it over outage reporting. It's kind of, again, giving an overview of the two types of resources and starting to dive into some of the market challenges. So you have hybrid resource, one resource ID, call it as two resource ID. They both should qualify for investment tax credit. Differences start here in terms of how renewable energy credits are calculated. For hybrid resources, we measure the point of interconnection, and for collocated resource would be measured at solar or whatever the renewable resource is output. So you potentially could have losses here. In other words, any kind of storage losses could be, you could lose RECs for them under hybrid resource status. That's something where, that's being worked on, and the CEC, the California Energy Commission, which tracks the RECs or issues the certificates, has recognized that this is sort of a vestige of old rules and that's something that should be changed. But I think between COVID and other things, it just kind of didn't happen yet. So we're hoping that this would be changed so that, in either case, you're getting the same credits because the same energy is being generated, but currently that's in question. Variable energy resource status, hybrid resource, you don't get it. As collocated resource, you do, so that has some scheduling advantages. You do get to use this dynamic limit tool as the hybrid resource and not as a collocated resource. I put a little star there because I'm hoping, or asterisk, because I'm hoping that CAISO may change its mind, but currently that's a no. In terms of RAIM exposure, and in California, RAIM is essentially resource adequacy availability incentive mechanism, which means that if your resource is in the RA supply plan, so providing RA capacity, it has a certain must-offer obligation, which was mentioned earlier. And so if they don't meet that obligation during certain hours, they actually get assessed charges. So for hybrid resources, they currently would not be exposed to RAIM, and that's, I'll call it CAISO trying to accommodate some of the challenges here. Collocated resource would be exposed to RAIM for the non-VR part. And VR resources essentially get a reduced RA credit through CPUC's process. They use this ELCC tool and then calculate, if you have 100 megawatts solar, you may only get, say, 20 megawatts of RA credit, but as a result, you do not have this RAIM exposure in the CAISO market. And so that kind of construct is preserved with the collocated resource. There's this new, in the CAISO RA enhancements initiative, they're proposing this new enforced capacity concept. It's part of the reason why also hybrid resources got a waiver in the RAIM exposure, because it's supposed to be temporary at this point. And then, soon enough, we will have this UCAP concept where the net qualifying capacity will have an additional consideration, which is essentially outages. And so, what is the actual capacity delivered to the grid, if you will, and to explain it simply. This is also another area where currently there seem to be differences between hybrid and collocated resources, and that's a question that's being asked and still in the process. For collocated resource, current track seems to be that the VR part wouldn't be exposed to it because it's already getting that ELCC treatment, but the storage part would be. But then a hybrid resource in aggregate would be exposed to UCAP, which it may make sense from one perspective, but also seems to kind of discriminate between the two resources that are actually physically identical. For both resources, there is the ability to provide AS, as Chris mentioned. I put a question mark on it because there's some, the way some of the detailed rules work, it's not clear that you can fully provide AS that you're capable of. And so that's, earlier was mentioned this capability that, you could deviate from CAISO schedule based on a VR production. CAISO only allows it actually deviation upward, not downward, I believe. And so, and the reasoning there is that, data for a hybrid resource, if you deviate, they don't want you to deviate in a way that would charge the battery less, because then battery would be less available than they forecast in the future. that thinking on one hand makes sense, but on the other hand does limit some of the things you can do in terms of AS or energy and how conservative or aggressive you want to be. And so risks are really, for hybrid resources, there's a potential loss of RECs for the best losses and potential for suboptimal dispatch or loss of revenue. So you're kind of trying to manage for these for this combined resource. For collocated resource, you're providing separate bids. CAISO ideally would be optimizing them, but if you're trying to control, for grid charging, there isn't really an effective way to tell CAISO you do not want to grid charge in the battery. And so, you would either have to manage it through, I'll call it very conservative bidding, but there isn't a clear tool to ensure no grid charging. CAISO is viewing this sort of, well, bid your cost, and if you're charged and there's cost to it, include in your bid. From a developer perspective, when I do the math, I don't think, within the bidding parameters, I don't think I can actually accurately include that loss. And so, there may be a tendency to want to participate as a hybrid resource because that may give more tools to reduce grid charging, but then there's this kind of suboptimal dispatch issue. Again, this is, I'll call it work in progress. Again, CAISO is looking at these issues, stakeholders are looking at them, and so we're hopeful that it will work out in a way that follows federal policy and also allows CAISO to make best use of these resources. So kind of dive a little bit deeper into the grid charging concerns. So this example is would I be concerned with the hybrid resources? Let's say you have a CAISO dispatch or CAISO award, and you're following it, and you're planning to charge your battery in the middle of the day, and let's say suddenly your variable resource output drops. Well, the CAISO would just expect you to keep charging, which would mean that you would have to pull some power off the grid. While ideally, I'd like to charge less, kind of matching what the VR output is to preserve the ITC. And this is kind of the deviation that really at least currently CAISO is not really okay with. And so there's a question of if you behave this way, well, are you violating CAISO rules, or would you just have to then bid more conservatively to allow for this variation in real time? And again, the more conservative you bid, less optimal the dispatch, and also less CAISO is getting less value from the resource too. So it's sort of a lose-lose in that scenario. So kind of conclusions and highlights, CAISO grid is expected to see significant resource addition in the next 10 years, 30 gigawatts an estimate, it's anybody's guess at this point, but obviously there'll be a lot of solar, a lot of energy storage. Hybrid collocated solar and storage resources or wind and storage have cost and timing advantage. And so there's cost savings from shared facilities and point of connection, timing savings if you already have an existing site. As mentioned earlier, also there's a site count from the obvious shared facilities value and kind of point of connect value. Also, if you're looking at the RA value in California, for example, if you have a 100 megawatt solar project, let's say maybe getting 20 megawatt of RA capacity, which means that you could put another resource, another at 80 megawatts of RA capacity with the same point of interconnect. So that's kind of an additional bonus from an RA perspective. CAISO is working with stakeholders on enabling hybrid and collocated resources and their market participation. The big issue was this POI sharing, which has been resolved. Other challenges are being discussed in stakeholder processes, and progress is being made. Maybe not the way everybody's happy with, but I'd like to say we're moving in the right direction. Obviously, bidding strategy and systems need to be developed. Hybrid resource bidding, to account for VR nature, best value, ITC risks, how to incorporate this dynamic tool use, and also, how to minimize any UCAP impact so that you're not losing RA. And that's, maybe I'm overthinking it's really simple, but to me it sounds like a fairly complex optimization. And then, if you have a collocated resource, maybe simple in certain ways, but there's kind of additional challenges there too. And so in either one of these, there's kind of a lot of things you're trying to optimize. And so, kind of things I'd like to see fixed is, one, the CAISO ensuring that grid charging can be managed as, not to jeopardize the ITC. And then also to have the CEC update the RPS handbook to ensure that proper rec accounting is independent of hybrid or collocated configuration. Right, same recs are being generated either way, the resource IDs configuration shouldn't change that. So that's all I had. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. And we've got some questions that I'd like to get to. We're probably going to go over a few minutes just to let folks know so that we can accommodate a few more questions. Going back to ERCOT. Do we expect to see a drop-off in standalone storage projects as reserve margins improve with the integration of dispatchable short-duration storage that can capitalize on the ORDC high-priced events? That's the operating reserve demand curve. John, you want to take that?
If I could answer questions like that, I could have retired a long time ago. Certainty. I mean, yeah. So reserve margins coming up coming up a lot in the forecast over the next couple of years. Like we saw a lot of storage in the interconnection queue, some major market participants building big projects, very publicly stating they plan on throwing a lot of megawatts at certain key ancillary services. I don't expect this trajectory that we see in ERCOT right now to stick around for a long time, but there are, as I mentioned earlier, some major transmission issues in ERCOT that I don't see the state of Texas throwing another CREZ as a solution to what's going on down there. I don't know that would be well received from a social political standpoint. And if you look at some of the other reports that were released by ERCOT at the end of 2020, there's still some periods of underserved energy that could create some risk for certain load pockets in the state. So kind of a mixed bag. That's sort of what we're keeping an eye on in terms of the kind of near and marginally long-term opportunity there.
Okay, thank you. That was well done. In California ISO, do auxiliary loads need to be metered separately? That's kind of a quick question. That's for Chris or Gijo.
It's a quick question. It is not a quick answer.
Okay, let's move on then.
Yeah. We're in active discussions with our utility that we're connecting with, at least basically for all of our projects. And so there's big questions of, do you basically have to have separate meters on everything so you can kind of calculate it? And the challenge is especially because depending on the battery operation, you have different classification of those auxiliary loads. And so, certain ones are clear, like if you have, perimeter lighting, well, that's separately metered as retail. But if you have like AC on the, temperature control on the battery, well, that's wholesale when your battery is operating. We're charging, discharging, providing market services, but could be retail at other times. And so that's really the challenge.
Okay, here's a quick question for, I don't know if this is a quick question. It's certainly probably not a quick answer. For Chris, how different are the connection options and dispatch strategy for a hybrid connecting to the distribution system rather than a FERC jurisdictional node?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and I'll just try to hit on that high level, but it should be pretty similar, and you should be able to operate it very similarly if you were on the transmission system versus distribution, and there is availability for distributed resources to participate in the wholesale markets. But as we've heard from some developers and some of the distribution operators in California, there are some new resources that are being built that do have some multi-use applications, and they have some distribution reliability rules in place for how they would be charged if there was a contingency or something that happens for reliability purposes on the distribution system. And there's going to be a need for the CAISO to talk to distribution operators and try to figure out, if there's some of these limitations, how do they affect some of the other rules for participating in MISO, in CAISO, like the must offer applications and RA rules. So that's something still to be worked out, and there could be some challenges there, but generally they should be allowed to participate on a pretty level playing field. So still some more work on that one.
If I can add to that.
Sure.
quick add, in a way, you almost have more options, again, depending on the specific interconnection, because you can kind of participate as a wholesale resource or potentially as distributed energy resource or even demand response if you're behind the meter. So in a way, you have more options, but in a way, you're also more limited because you could have, for example, distribution circuit charging limitations. So you know to charge, but your distribution circuit may not allow you to do that. And so there's more complexities in addition to what Chris.
All right, thanks. There's a question. Well, anybody who wants to can answer this. What do you expect the impact of increasing state renewable portfolio standards, that is requiring greater use of renewable energies, to have on the rules that you have been discussing? So what happens to these rules when higher RPS standards are imposed?
I'll jump in here and just say that I think that the GHG rules, RPS rules, and anything that's trying to really advance renewables and other type of clean energy, I think are really forcing the hand of regulators and the ISO markets in a sense of trying to allow for flexibility and advance some of these technologies and be more nimble as far as that goes. So I think it will continue to try to open things up to allow these resources to participate in a way that is useful and reliable to the grid and helps integrate those renewables as we get more and more of them onto the grid. And I think that's really the benefit that we're seeing of some of these more policy level, state level policies that they're really pushing new resource development. And I think it helps the ISO, CAISO, and PUC and others to really advance those proposals in a way that allows for that flexibility. And obviously there's challenges in doing that, and they need to address those too for reliability and market concerns, but at the same time, I think it is helping to advance those things in a way that allows for us to capture the benefits of these new technologies.
Okay. Here's a question. How does California determine what proportion of hybrid resource capacity can be credited for resource adequacy?
Well, I'll jump in again, and maybe GGL can add if he has any other thoughts on it, but they have a methodology that the PUC's approved where they essentially look at the variable resource component and its ELCC value, and then the storage 4-hour duration capacity value, and they combine those. And then there's some nuance to that rule, and essentially, there's a reduction based on how much you use the storage to charge from the on-site solar, potentially reducing the solar value a little bit, or if the storage is oversized enough to where it can't be fully charged from the on-site solar facility, then they might reduce the storage amount slightly as well, depending on the various storage and renewable sizing, and how much you can charge the on-site resource during the day. So that's one of the nuances to it, and kind of why I was mentioning earlier that it's important to think about the sizing of the relative components of a hybrid resource. And they've also applied that similarly for the co-located resources. So if there's any kind of limitations there, it does have a little bit of an impact on the RA value. But generally, it's the ELCC of the VER component and the 4-hour duration of the storage combined.
And just to add to that, kind of related to the other question of, can as you have policies, economics changing the resource mix, the RA rules have really kind of been pushed to the limit, and have started to evolve in California. So we may see significant changes in California how these resources are accounted for RA, but that's the evolving work in progress, both at the CPUC and CAISO.
Okay, thank you. There's a few more questions, but I think we're going to have to wrap it up. I'm afraid we've pretty much gone through the time that we had allotted. I'd like to remind everybody that we do have the 2021 Policy Forum coming up in a couple of weeks. Please check the website for that, and best wishes for the rest of your day, and hoping that you stay safe and healthy.